Welcome back to the DRM podcast, episode 4. We're covering some big global stories, as always, in under 12 minutes. You know our tagline. Let's tell stories that travel the world in today. Well, we're diving into a story making headlines pretty much everywhere. Donald Trump's second inauguration as President of the United States. Just a few days away now, January 20th, 2025. Now, you might be thinking, okay, another inauguration, what's the big deal?
Yeah.
Well, get this. This inauguration's got a pretty chilly challenge. Literally.
Yeah, that's right. This inauguration is going to be mostly indoors. Big change from how it's usually done. And it's all because of this crazy cold snap hitting D.C. feet. Forecasts are saying it could drop to a brutal -11 degrees C. And that's not even factoring in the wind chill. This isn't just some local thing either. This is part of a huge polar vortex hitting the whole U.S.
Wow, -11 degrees C.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's definitely not the best weather for an outdoor ceremony, especially one as big as a presidential inauguration.
Yeah.
So how's all this impacting the event itself?
Well, first off, that iconic image of the inauguration, the swearing-in ceremony on the steps of the Capitol building, it's moved. Just picture it. Instead of those grand outdoor steps, the whole ceremony will be held in the Capitol Rotunda. For our international listeners, that's a circular room inside the Capitol building, famous for its dome and its historical significance.
Moving the inauguration indoors because of weather? That's going to be pretty unusual, right? How often does that even happen?
Oh, it's super rare. Like the last time an inauguration got changed up this much because of weather was way back in 1985 for Ronald Reagan's second inauguration.
So this is a pretty big deal then. What other changes are they making to deal with the weather and this move indoors?
Well, the parade down Pennsylvania Avenue, a big part of the whole inauguration thing, that's been affected too. They're going to hold it in a modified form at Capital One Arena. It's a 20,000 capacity venue downtown. Oh, and that same arena, by the way, is also hosting the 3 inaugural balls they've got planned for the evening.
That's a lot of changes. What about people who already had tickets for the outdoor events?
Yeah, good point. There are probably thousands of people scrambling to figure out what to do. People with tickets to the outdoor events, they've got to figure out how to get into the arena, and then there's capacity limits and all that.
And what about people who are planning to gather on the National Mall to see the ceremony?
Big change for them, too. The National Mall is where everyone usually gathers to watch the inauguration, right? But with the ceremony moved indoors, they'll have to find other ways to participate, like watching it live on TV.
So the weather's really forcing some big changes to the whole inauguration. For a president who's all about big, enthusiastic crowds, this indoor venue creates a very different dynamic.
Totally. And that brings up an interesting point. Trump, as we know, is really vocal about the size of the crowds at his events. Often claims bigger numbers than what independent estimates show. Like his first inauguration back in 2017, remember, he claimed 1.5 million people were there.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Crowd experts disputed that number pretty heavily.
I imagine it'll be interesting to see how he talks about the crowd size this time. It's inevitably going to be smaller. Do you think he'll downplay it, maybe blame it all on the weather? Or maybe he'll find a way to spin it in a positive light?
That's the million-dollar question. It'll be fascinating to see how his team handles that whole messaging thing. But remember, even though the overall crowd size might be smaller, there are tons of people watching this inauguration all over the world.
Oh, absolutely. And speaking of the global audience, there's one attendee causing quite a stir. Vice President Han Zheng from China.
Right. This is a big deal. This is the first time a high-ranking Chinese leader is going to be at a U.S. presidential inauguration. Remember, for his first inauguration, Trump kind of broke tradition by inviting a bunch of foreign leaders, including Chinese President Xi Jinping.
Yeah, and Xi Jinping declined the invitation back then. But the fact that he's sending his vice president this time is definitely something to pay attention to.
It is. What's interesting here is that China's kind of walking a diplomatic tightrope. On the one hand, they're sending a high-level representative showing they want to keep things good with the U.S. But on the other hand, they know there could be trade conflicts and political tensions under a second Trump administration. It's a tough balancing act for sure. China wants to keep talking, but they're also getting ready for things to maybe get rough again.
So it's friendly gesture, but with some caution mixed in.
Exactly. It'll be interesting to see how this all plays out during Trump's second term. Will we see more of those trade wars and political back and forth that happened during his first term, or will things change? Will there be more cooperation?
I guess we'll have to wait and see. But China's not the only country making a statement with their attendance at this inauguration. We've also got Argentinian President Javier Milei and Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni on the guest list.
Yeah, that's right. Both Milei and Meloni are seen as right-wing populist leaders, a lot like Trump himself. Them being there could mean stronger ties between these countries, and maybe even a more coordinated approach to global issues from a right-wing perspective.
It's interesting to see how this inauguration, even though it's moved indoors and scaled back a bit, is still attracting so much international attention.
Hmm.
And it's definitely shaping global political dynamics.
Absolutely. This whole thing with the weather and moving everything indoors reminds me of a pretty chilling story from U.S. history.
Oh, really? Tell me more.
Well, picture this. It's 1841, and William Henry Harrison, the ninth president of the United States, is giving his inaugural address. It's freezing cold, but Harrison, wanting to show everyone how strong and tough he is, refuses to wear a coat. He goes on to give the longest inaugural address ever outside in the freezing cold.
Oof, that doesn't sound good. What happened?
Well, Harrison caught a really bad cold, and it turned into pneumonia. He died just a month later. His presidency ended up being the shortest in U.S. history.
Wow. That's a scary reminder of how dangerous extreme cold can be. Makes Trump's decision to move the inauguration indoors seem pretty smart, even if it means going against tradition and dealing with some logistical headaches.
Totally agree. It's a decision that puts safety and people's well-being above how things look and what's traditionally been done.
It's a reminder that even the most powerful people in the world can't escape the forces of nature.
Exactly. And in a way, this unusual inauguration might actually be a fitting way to start Trump's second term.
How so?
Well, think about it. A second-term president, breaking with tradition, dealing with unexpected challenges, navigating tricky global relationships, and all this happening while a powerful weather event is shaking things up. It kind of sums up the unpredictability and potential for disruption that we might see over the next 4 years.
That's a good point. It's like this inauguration is a mini version of what's going on in global politics right now.
Right. It's a moment that shows how power is shifting, the tough parts of leadership, and all the unknowns that are out there.
Yeah, it really feels like we're at some kind of turning point, both here in the U.S. and around the world. And it's all happening with this wild weather event that's literally changing how the inauguration is going to happen.
It really does make you think, right? Even with all our technology and planning, nature can still throw a wrench in things.
It makes you wonder, will this change of venue, moving everything indoors, will it change the tone or the message of the inauguration?
That's a really good question. The Capitol Rotunda, it's a smaller space, more controlled. It's definitely going to create a different atmosphere than that big outdoor setting we're used to. It might feel more intimate, more focused, but maybe it won't have that same grandeur, that visual impact of a huge crowd on the National Mall.
Do you think that could actually work in Trump's favor? Could he use this smaller setting to get a specific message across?
It's possible. Without the spectacle of a giant crowd, the focus might shift to what he actually says in his speech, his plans for the future, the policies he wants to push. It could even let him connect with the audience on a more personal level, even if there are fewer people actually there.
So some people might see this weather situation as a problem, but it could actually be a chance for Trump to control the narrative a bit.
Yeah, exactly. And it'll be interesting to see how the media covers all this. Will they focus on how unusual this is, all the logistical stuff, or will they dig into what Trump actually says and what it might mean for his second term?
It's definitely going to be interesting to watch it all play out. We've got a second-term president, an inauguration moved indoors because of this crazy cold snap, and people all over the world are watching to see what happens. What are some key things our listeners should keep in mind as they watch the inauguration?
Okay, first, pay attention to how Trump says things and what he talks about in his speech. What's he trying to tell people, not just in America, but everywhere? Second, watch how he interacts with those international guests, especially Vice President Han Zheng from China. Those little moments could give us hints about what U.S. China relations might look like in the future. And last but not least, remember that this inauguration, as weird as it might be, is just the start. The real story is what happens in the days, weeks, and months after Trump starts his second term.
Good advice. It seems like this inauguration, even with the unusual setting, is just the beginning of what could be a really interesting and maybe even a bit wild time in American history and for global politics in general.
For sure. The whole world's watching and a lot is at stake.
We'll definitely be watching closely too. And we'll be back tomorrow to break down the key events and talk about what they might mean. Thanks for joining us on the DRM podcast. Let's tell stories that travel the world.